Callum Reed only wanted to board the plane, take the seat he had already confirmed, and go home quietly after 3 exhausting days of negotiation. But Vivian Blackwell, the ice-cold chief executive of Blackwell Aero, looked at his worn jacket and scuffed shoes as if she were staring at a mistake seated in first class. She ordered him moved to the back of the plane. Laughter rippled down the aisle. Callum did not argue. He simply rested his hand on the armrest. The moment the cabin door sealed shut, the captain switched on the intercom and said the owner of this flight was sitting in seat 1A. If you enjoy stories where arrogance finally meets its match, press subscribe on this channel so you never miss what happens next. The rain fell in thin gray sheets over the tarmac at Dallas-Fort Worth International that morning, and Callum Reed walked through the private terminal without ceremony. His jacket was old, the collar frayed at the edges, and the screen of his phone carried a long crack down the corner. He carried no assistant, no bodyguard, no gleaming suitcase trailing behind him on silent wheels. He walked the way a man walks when he has spent years learning that comfort is not the same thing as belonging, quiet, measured, unbothered by the marble floors around him. At the priority counter, he presented a confirmation code for seat 1A on a private charter operated under the Blackwell Aero name. The young woman behind the counter glanced at his jacket, then his shoes, then back at his face, certain he had wandered into the wrong terminal. Callum said nothing about the look. He simply repeated the code, calm and unhurried, the way a man repeats himself when he already knows how the story ends. She typed the letters into her terminal, and her expression shifted from doubt to confusion. Behind him in line, a group of men in tailored overcoats laughed loudly about a golf trip planned for the following weekend, entirely unaware that the quiet figure ahead of them held more influence over the airline they were about to board than any title printed on their business cards. Callum did not mind being overlooked. He had learned, in the years since losing his place at Blackwell Aero, that the people who mattered least to a room's outcome were often the ones making the most noise inside it, and the people who mattered most were frequently standing quietly near the back, waiting for the right moment to speak. No one standing in that terminal understood that this was not an ordinary charter. It was a flight built to carry a handful of executives, major investors, and board members toward New York, where a merger worth billions was scheduled to be signed within hours. Callum was not there to be noticed. He wanted only to reach his seat on time, because tucked inside his worn leather case sat documents proving he had quietly acquired controlling rights over this very flight, the company that operated it, and a portion of the debt now strangling Blackwell Aero from the inside. He found a chair near the boarding gate and sat with the case resting against his leg, watching the rain slide down the windows in long, uneven lines. He thought briefly of his daughter waiting for him at home, of the promise he had made to be back before her recital, and the thought steadied him more than any boardroom ever had. Power, to Callum, had never been about being seen. It had always been about surviving long enough to matter again. Around him, other travelers moved through the terminal in expensive coats and polished shoes, speaking in the clipped, confident tones of people who had never once been questioned about their right to occupy a space. None of them looked at him twice, and that suited him fine. He had spent years being underestimated by rooms exactly like this one, boardrooms where his ideas were absorbed and his name quietly erased from the credit line, and he had learned that being invisible sometimes offered a clearer view of the truth than being celebrated ever could. He thought of the years after his wife died, the long nights spent learning to manage a household alone, the mornings he arrived late to meetings because there had been no one else to care for his daughter. Nobody in that terminal knew any of it, and nobody needed to. He had not built his quiet fortune to announce himself to strangers. He had built it because grief, when it does not destroy a person, sometimes leaves behind an unshakable clarity about what actually matters. and Callum intended to use that clarity exactly once, on exactly this flight. The young woman at the counter called toward a colleague in a low voice when the name Callum Reed appeared on her screen, highlighted in gold, a flag she had never seen before in 3 years on the job. She reached for the internal directory to understand what the color meant, but before she could finish typing the search, a sharp voice cut across the terminal, and Vivian Blackwell arrived like weather no one had been warned about. Vivian Blackwell entered the private lounge the way a queen enters a room she already owns. Her white suit was tailored to the inch, a diamond watch caught the overhead light, and an assistant trailed 2 steps behind her, carrying a tablet loaded with the day's schedule. Every employee within sight straightened their posture the instant she appeared. She was headed to New York to meet with the largest shareholders of her family's company, and she intended to arrive exactly as powerful as she looked. When she noticed Callum seated near the gate reserved for board-level travelers, her eyebrows drew together in open irritation. She turned to Graham Whitlock, the head of VIP security, and asked in a voice meant to carry why a delivery worker had been allowed to linger in a space meant for people of consequence. Graham apologized to her immediately, his tone thick with the eagerness of a man who had built his career on flattering the wealthy, and he moved quickly toward Callum to ask him to step aside. Callum lifted his boarding pass without rising from his chair and said simply that his seat was 1A. For a moment the lounge went quiet, then a ripple of soft laughter passed between 2 board members standing near the window. Vivienne studied the boarding pass herself, saw the letters confirming his claim, and decided immediately that a mistake had occurred somewhere in the reservation system, or perhaps a seat had been sold to the wrong person entirely by an assistant who would soon regret it. She delivered her judgment without softening a single word, telling him that seat 1A was not simply a place to sit but a statement about status, and that he did not belong inside that statement. Callum did not raise his voice or straighten in outrage. He only asked, evenly, whether she truly intended to change a seat that had already been confirmed through proper channels. She answered that inside her own company she decided who sat where and no system override would tell her otherwise. He looked past her shoulder at the Blackwell arrow emblem mounted on the terminal wall, its silver letters gleaming under the lounge lighting, and said quietly that perhaps today she would learn again exactly who this company belonged to. She did not understand the weight behind the sentence, and she walked away already convinced the matter was settled in her favor. Vivienne had built her entire identity around the certainty that she could read a room in seconds, sorting the powerful from the forgettable with a single glance, and she trusted that instinct the way other people trusted gravity. She had inherited the company from her father, along with his conviction that appearances were not decoration but evidence, that the right suit and the right posture told a truer story than any resume ever could. Standing in that lounge, she felt no doubt at all that the man in the worn jacket had simply wandered into a life that was not built for him. What she could not have known, and would not have believed even if someone had warned her, was that the calm in Callum's voice was not politeness. It was patience, the particular kind that belongs to a person who has already won and is simply waiting for everyone else to catch up to the fact. Graham stepped forward and pulled Callum a few paces from the gate, while Vivienne's assistant instructed the counter staff to move him to the rear of the business cabin instead. Nora Ellis, the young employee working the terminal that morning, hesitated because her screen displayed a locked notice on seat 1A, a message reading that any change required owner-level clearance, a permission tier she had never once seen triggered in her career. Vivienne's patience thinned visibly. She told Nora to override the system manually and log the change under her own authority, promising that any consequence would fall on her alone. A cluster of executives nearby began murmuring among themselves, amused by the unfolding scene. One finance director leaned toward a colleague and joked under his breath that the man in the worn jacket had probably won his ticket in some kind of promotional drawing. Callum stepped away from the counter and made a short phone call to Evelyn Carrington, the attorney who managed his aviation trust. He did not explain the situation at length. He simply told her that someone had just interfered with ownership rights attached to Seat 1A and asked her to record the exact time it happened. Vivian overheard the word attorney and laughed under her breath, assuming he intended some minor lawsuit for compensation. The kind, wealthy companies settled quietly a dozen times a year without consequence. She instructed Graham to board Callum last, away from the other passengers, so the appearance of the first-class cabin would not be, in her words, compromised before takeoff. Callum accepted the instruction without protest, because he had no need to win an argument at the gate. What he needed was for every person in that terminal to keep generating evidence of their own choices before the cabin door finally closed behind them. Nora glanced at her screen once more while the boarding line moved forward, and the color drained from her face when new text appeared beneath the locked notice, confirming that a flight ownership transfer had been completed under an entity called Reed Aviation Trust. She looked up toward Vivian, opened her mouth to explain what she had just seen, and then closed it again, uncertain whether raising the alarm would cost her the job she had worked 3 years to earn. Around her, the boarding line inched forward in polite, oblivious order, executives checking messages on their phones, assistants juggling garment bags, none of them aware that the ground beneath the entire operation had just shifted in a way none of their titles could undo. Nora decided, in that single quiet moment of hesitation, that she would say nothing until someone with more authority than her forced the truth into the open, and she slid her hands beneath the counter so no one would notice they had begun to tremble. The first-class cabin gleamed with soft lighting and polished leather, Seat 1A positioned at the very front beside the window, closest to the cockpit and farthest from doubt. Callum boarded last, exactly as instructed, and found Vivienne already seated in his place, a glass of sparkling water resting on the tray table beside her, as though she had reclaimed a throne that had briefly slipped from her grasp. She gestured toward a seat several rows back and announced, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, that she had found him something more suitable. A wealthy passenger across the aisle smirked openly at the remark. Graham stood near the front of the cabin and added, with unnecessary volume, that Callum should feel grateful he had been allowed to board the flight at all given the confusion he had caused. Callum looked once at Seat 1A, then back at Vivian, and nothing in his expression cracked under the weight of the room's attention. He told her plainly that he did not need something more suitable, only something correct. She asked with a thin smile, correct according to whom, according to him, or according to some fantasy of a world he imagined he belonged to. The question landed hard enough to silence the cabin for a long moment. Callum did not answer with anger. He simply took the open seat offered to him, set his worn case beneath his feet, and folded his hands in his lap with the patience of a man who had learned long ago that some battles are won by waiting rather than shouting. Captain Miles Archer stepped out briefly to greet the passengers before departure, and his eyes lingered on Callum for a fraction longer than protocol required, a flicker of quiet recognition passing between them. Vivian noticed the pause but read nothing into it beyond simple courtesy, assuming the captain greeted every passenger with the same practiced warmth. Miles had flown for Blackwell Aero long enough to remember the years before Vivian's father passed the company down, long enough to remember a younger engineer who used to walk the hangar late at night, checking fuel calculations no one had asked him to check twice. He had never forgotten the name Callum Reed, even after it disappeared from every internal memo and every press release celebrating the very system that man had built. Protocol required him to say nothing until instructed, and so he said nothing, but the respect in his brief nod carried more honesty than anything spoken aloud in that cabin all morning. Before the aircraft pushed back from the gate, Callum sent a short message from his cracked phone, 4 words that set a chain of legal confirmations into motion far above the clouds they were about to enter. He watched the flight attendants move through their final checks, watched Vivian cross her legs and flip through her merger documents without a single glance in his direction, and felt none of the satisfaction he might have expected. There was no pleasure in watching someone walk unknowingly toward a reckoning they had built for themselves. There was only the quiet, steady weight of responsibility, the sense that once the truth surfaced, there would be no gentle way to deliver it, and that the people most surprised by it would also be the ones least prepared to hear it with grace. The plane eased away from the gate as the cabin lights dimmed for departure, and Vivian allowed herself to believe the unpleasantness was finished. She opened a folder of merger documents on her lap, running through the closing remarks she planned to deliver once the plane landed in New York, rehearsing the confident cadence she used whenever cameras were near. Then the intercom crackled to life with unexpected formality. Captain Miles Archer's voice filled the cabin, steady and deliberate, informing every passenger that before departure a change in operating authority required immediate acknowledgement. He explained that the flight currently operated under the control of an entity called Reed Aviation Trust, and that according to filed legal records, the designated owner of that trust was presently seated aboard the aircraft. Vivian's head snapped upright. The captain continued without hesitation, stating that under internal protocol, Seat 1A was reserved for the owner of the aircraft, and he asked that Callum Reed please return to his assigned position at the front of the cabin. The air inside the plane seemed to freeze mid-breath. The passenger who had smirked earlier stared down at his own hands. Graham stood frozen near the galley, his mouth slightly open. Vivian remained seated in Seat 1A, her fingers tightening around the glass on her tray table until her knuckles paled. Callum rose slowly from his seat, unhurried, without a trace of triumph twisting his expression. He walked forward through the narrow aisle and stopped beside her chair, speaking in a voice too quiet for theater and too firm for doubt, telling her simply that she was sitting in his seat. He did not raise his voice, and he did not need to. Every person in that cabin had already heard the captain's words, and every person understood, in the space of a single sentence, that the balance of power aboard this aircraft had shifted completely. Vivian looked up at him, searching his face for some sign of cruelty or satisfaction, some proof that he intended to make her suffer the way she had tried to make him suffer at the gate that morning. She found none of it. Only the same steady patience he had carried since the moment they met, and somehow that absence of malice unsettled her far more than open anger would have. Vivian stood in front of every executive she had once hoped to impress that morning, forced to surrender the exact symbol of status she had used to humiliate him only an hour before. For a long moment she did not move, her mind scrambling to find a version of events in which this made sense, in which the man in the worn jacket could not possibly hold the authority the captain had just described. She looked toward Graham, hoping for some correction, some assurance that a mistake had occurred, but he only stared back at her with the blank expression of a man who understood that his career had just become a great deal more fragile. The executives seated around them, who moments earlier had traded amused glances at Callum's expense, now studied their own hands or their phones, suddenly desperate not to be the next person singled out for their earlier behavior. She tried to hold on to what remained of her composure, insisting that purchasing a flight did not grant him any authority over Blackwell Aero itself. Callum lowered himself into Seat 1A at last and opened his worn case, drawing out a thick folder of documents with the unhurried care of a man who had waited a long time for this exact moment to arrive. He explained that he had not simply bought a ticket, nor rented an aircraft for a single afternoon of theater. He had quietly acquired the subsidiary company responsible for operating this very flight, using a trust registered under his own name months earlier, long before anyone in that cabin had reason to notice. The reason traced back to Blackwell Aero's mounting debt, hidden for years behind a failed acquisition that Sterling Hawthorne and the executive board had concealed by quietly selling off auxiliary aviation assets. None of them had realized the final buyer standing at the end of that chain was Callum Reed himself. Vivian's shock did not soften her pride completely. She asked, almost involuntarily, how a man dressed the way he was could possibly command that kind of capital. Callum told her he had once been the founding engineer behind the fuel routing system that had quietly saved Blackwell Aero enormous sums a decade earlier, technology that had multiplied the company's value many times over. His name had vanished from every internal record not long after his wife passed away, when he stepped back from the company to raise his daughter alone, and someone in leadership decided his absence was an opportunity rather than a loss. He had not returned that morning to flaunt wealth in front of strangers. He had returned to reclaim what had quietly been taken from him, his intellectual property, his founding stake, and the professional dignity stripped away while he was too grief-stricken to notice it disappearing. He spoke without theater, laying each document on the tray table in front of him with the same unhurried patience he had shown at the gate hours earlier, as though he understood that the truth needed no embellishment to be devastating. Vivian read through the papers herself, her eyes moving faster with every page, searching for some flaw in the argument that would let her dismiss it as easily as she had dismissed the man himself. She found none. What she found instead was her own father's signature on an early funding document, approving a partnership with an engineer whose name had somehow vanished from every subsequent filing, a silence in the company's history that suddenly made a terrible kind of sense. She remembered, faintly, a conversation from her childhood, her father mentioning an engineer who had left the company under difficult circumstances, a man whose departure he described only as unfortunate timing. She had never asked for details, because as a teenager the affairs of the company felt distant and unimportant, a world of numbers and contracts that belonged entirely to her father now. Holding proof that the unfortunate timing had actually been a deliberate erasure, she felt something close to shame settle over the pride she had worn into that cabin only hours earlier. At the back of the cabin, a tablet chimed softly in front of every board member seated aboard the aircraft, each screen displaying an urgent notice from Evelyn Carrington announcing an emergency board review concerning a formal claim filed by Callum Reed against Blackwell Aero. No one on that aircraft could leave, and no one could pretend ignorance any longer. The entire board of Blackwell Aero sat trapped inside a cabin belonging, at least for the duration of this flight, to the very man they had spent the morning dismissing. Sterling Hawthorne attempted to interject, insisting loudly that this entire episode amounted to nothing more than a legal stunt engineered for leverage. But Evelyn Carrington joined the conversation through the aircraft's private conferencing screen, presenting founding agreements, patent registrations, and old internal correspondence bearing Sterling's own signature on an arrangement designed to erase Callum's ownership stake from the company's records permanently. Vivian began to understand, with a cold and creeping clarity, that she herself might have been misled by the very board she trusted most. Pride, however, kept her from apologizing outright. She asked Callum directly why he had not simply announced who he was the moment he arrived at the terminal that morning. He answered without bitterness, saying he wanted to witness exactly how people like her treated someone they assumed carried no power at all, because the way a person treats someone they believe cannot help them says more about their character than any performance staged for an audience that matters. The words struck the cabin like a slow exhale after held breath. The passengers who had laughed at him earlier now studied their own hands in silence. Nora Ellis, reached by the captain over a secure line from the ground crew, confirmed under gentle questioning that Vivienne herself had personally ordered the manual override of a locked seating system that morning. Vivienne had not merely lost seat 1A that day. She had lost the illusion that she controlled every outcome around her simply because she occupied the highest chair in the room. She thought back unwillingly to every meeting over the years where Sterling had steered conversations away from certain names, certain patents, certain uncomfortable questions about how the company had grown so quickly after a founder's quiet departure. She had never asked those questions herself, because asking them had never seemed necessary when the numbers kept climbing and the shareholders kept smiling. Now, sitting across from a man she had tried to banish to the back of an airplane, she understood that comfort and truth were rarely the same thing, and that she had spent years mistaking one for the other. The aircraft leveled off at cruising altitude while the atmosphere inside the cabin remained taut, closer to a courtroom than a private charter. Vivienne assumed the worst of the morning had already passed. That public embarrassment among colleagues was the full weight of the reckoning she would face. Callum delivered a second revelation that proved otherwise. Through Reed Aviation Trust, he explained, he now held voting rights assigned to him by the largest group of creditors currently owed money by Blackwell Aero. That meant the merger worth billions. The very deal Vivienne intended to finalize in New York within hours could not proceed without his signature attached. Sterling's face lost all color. He understood, faster than anyone else aboard, that if Callum chose to block the deal, the entire arrangement, designed to quietly transfer Blackwell Aero's core assets to a rival group, would collapse before it ever reached paper. He had spent nearly a year assembling that arrangement in careful, deniable pieces, convincing himself the whole time that he was simply protecting the company from its own inefficiencies. Hearing it summarized so plainly in front of the full board stripped away every justification he had built for himself, leaving only the bare shape of what the deal actually was. A quiet transfer of value away from the people who had built the company and toward a small circle who stood to profit from its decline. Vivienne, for the first time that morning, found herself without a ready answer. She asked Callum plainly what he actually wanted from all of this, whether it was money, status, or some kind of apology delivered in front of witnesses. Callum told her he wanted three things, nothing more. First, his name restored properly to the founding record of the technology he had built. Second, an independent investigation into Sterling Hawthorne's conduct. Third, fair compensation for the engineers and technical staff who had been wrongfully dismissed in the years following his own departure. He mentioned no personal revenge, no desire to humiliate anyone further than the truth already had. That restraint embarrassed Vivienne more deeply than any accusation could have, because it revealed a kind of integrity her own leadership had never modeled for the people beneath her. She realized, watching him fold his hands calmly over the documents, that a man capable of dismantling her company had chosen instead to ask for fairness, and that the choice said more about him than any amount of wealth ever could. Near the rear galley, Sterling quietly typed a message to his legal team, demanding they discredit Callum before the plane landed, unaware that the aircraft's shared display system had briefly synced with his device and projected the message onto every screen in the cabin. The message from Sterling appeared across the shared displays for only a few seconds, but it was more than enough for every passenger to read it clearly. Heads turned toward him in unison. He fumbled through an explanation about a technical malfunction, but Callum calmly presented further evidence, records showing Sterling had personally engineered Callum's removal years earlier, then used the very technology Callum built as the Betrayal for a funding pitch, that enriched himself and a small circle of allies. Vivian found herself cornered between two impossible choices. Protecting Sterling meant almost certainly losing the company within months, once the truth surfaced publicly. Standing beside Callum meant admitting, in front of everyone she led, that she had humiliated an innocent man and had run her company on blind faith in appearances rather than substance. Callum did not demand she kneel or beg forgiveness for her mistake. He asked only one question, quiet and direct, whether she wanted to save Blackwell Arrow or simply save her own pride. Vivian sat with the question far longer than comfort allowed, the cabin holding its collective breath around her. She finally rose and addressed the board directly, ordering Sterling's authority suspended immediately, demanding an emergency investigation open without delay, and halting the merger entirely until Callum's claims could be reviewed in full. Sterling found himself suddenly isolated, and several allies who had followed his lead only minutes earlier began quietly distancing themselves from him in real time. The man who had been thrown out of seat 1A only hours before had just redirected the strategic course of an entire corporation still 30,000 feet above the ground. Sterling tried once more to argue his case, appealing to years of loyalty and results, reminding the board of every quarter he had delivered growth they had celebrated without asking too many questions about its origins. No one answered him. The silence that followed was its own verdict, heavier than any formal vote could have been, and he sat back in his seat with the stunned expression of a man watching a structure he had spent years reinforcing collapse in a matter of minutes. The aircraft descended into New York under a pale afternoon sky, but the reception waiting on the tarmac did not match the one Vivian had planned for herself. Attorneys, auditors, and shareholder representatives stood assembled near the terminal, and every one of them turned their attention first toward Callum Reed, rather than the chief executive stepping down the stairs behind him. Graham Whitlock tried to slip away unnoticed through a side exit, but Callum called him back. Many expected Callum to humiliate him in return for the morning's treatment. Instead, he asked only that the incident be documented honestly, and he recommended that Nora Ellis be given temporary authority over VIP boarding procedures, since she alone had raised concern when the system had been overridden without proper cause. Vivian walked several paces behind Callum, stripped of the confidence she had carried onto the plane that morning. Facing reporters gathered near the gate, she could not reveal every detail of what had transpired above the clouds, but she announced that Blackwell Arrow would delay its pending merger to review matters of intellectual property and internal governance more thoroughly. One reporter asked Callum directly whether he now considered himself the new owner of Blackwell Arrow. He answered simply that he had not come back to sit above anyone, only to reclaim something that had once been taken from beneath his name. Another reporter pressed further, asking how it felt to be publicly humiliated only hours before revealing his true position. Callum considered the question for a moment before answering that the humiliation had told him everything he needed to know about how the company treated people it believed held no power, and that the answer had confirmed exactly why the investigation mattered as much as the ownership dispute itself. Vivian heard the answer and understood, perhaps for the first time, that Callum's danger to people like her had nothing to do with wealth at all. It came from the fact that he could not be bought by the approval of people who had spent their lives believing approval was the only currency that mattered. As they crossed the terminal, Evelyn approached Callum quietly and told him that if the board voted that same evening, he stood a real chance of becoming the company's new chairman before the sun rose again. Callum thanked her, then asked instead whether his daughter's recital that evening could still be reached if the vote ran long. Evelyn smiled for the first time all day, telling him she would make certain of it herself if necessary. It was a small exchange, easily missed by anyone rushing past them through the terminal, but it captured something essential about the man at the center of the day's upheaval, a person who had just reshaped the future of a billion-dollar company and was already thinking about being home in time for his daughter's violin piece. Inside the glass tower belonging to Blackwell Arrow that evening, the board convened an emergency session under harsh fluorescent light. Sterling's voting rights remained frozen, stripped from him for the duration of the review. Vivian sat across from Callum at the long conference table, no longer holding the commanding position she had wielded aboard the aircraft only hours before. Several minority shareholders unexpectedly aligned themselves with Callum's claim, revealing that they too had been kept in the dark by Sterling's maneuvering for years. One elderly shareholder, who had held stock in the company since its earliest days, admitted quietly that she had always wondered why the engineer behind the fuel routing breakthrough had never once appeared at a shareholder meeting to be thanked, and that the board's silence on the matter had troubled her more than she had ever said aloud. Evelyn laid out her case methodically, demonstrating that the technology Callum had engineered formed the very foundation of the company's current market value, and warning that continued denial of his rightful ownership could expose Blackwell Arrow to devastating litigation over patents and prior agreements. Vivienne eventually rose from her chair and offered Callum an apology in front of the assembled board. Not a polished or theatrical one, but a plain admission that she had judged him by his appearance and used her authority to humiliate a man who had done nothing to deserve it. Callum accepted the apology without gloating, though he did not release her from accountability entirely. He asked that she remain in her role as chief executive only if she agreed to restructure company ownership transparently and establish a fund to support engineers who had been wrongfully pushed out under the previous administration. The board called a vote before midnight. Callum did not seek the title of chief executive for himself. Instead, the board appointed him executive chairman, granting him strategic veto authority over major decisions moving forward. He accepted the position with the same quiet composure he had carried through the entire ordeal, offering no speech, no celebration, only a brief acknowledgement that the work ahead mattered far more than the title attached to it. Vivian remained chief executive of Blackwell Arrow, but from that night onward, every significant decision she made would first pass through the judgment of the very man she had once ordered, removed from seat 1A. It was an arrangement neither of them had wanted at breakfast that morning, and yet by nightfall it had become the only outcome that made sense. A partnership built not on comfort but on the hard, unglamorous work of correcting a wrong that had gone unaddressed for far too long. Walking out of the boardroom long after midnight, she found herself replaying the morning's events with a clarity she had avoided all day. The terminal, the laughter, the certainty in her own voice as she declared he did not belong. She had believed, without ever examining the belief, that a person's worth could be read from their jacket and their shoes. The lesson had cost her almost everything she valued, and she suspected, walking alone through the empty hallway, that she would spend a long time earning back the respect she had once assumed was permanent. Several weeks later, Callum returned to the same airport where the entire ordeal had begun. This time there were no crowds, no reporters trailing behind him, no board members whispering in his direction. He wore the same simple clothing as before and carried the same worn case, as though nothing about the intervening weeks had changed the man underneath the headlines. Blackwell Arrow announced a new policy shortly afterward, reserving one seat of honor on every board-level flight for an engineer, ground crew member, or worker whose quiet contributions had gone unnoticed for years. Vivienne herself signed the policy into effect, a small gesture that carried far more weight than any public statement she could have issued, and privately she considered it the truest apology she knew how to offer, quieter than words but far harder to reverse. Nora Ellis was promoted to Senior Manager of Customer Experience. Her early instinct for caution finally recognized as the asset it had always been. She often thought back to that morning at the counter, the trembling in her hands as she stared at the locked notice on the screen, and understood now that the small act of hesitating, of refusing to override a system she did not fully trust, had mattered more than she could have imagined at the time. Graham Whitlock faced an internal review that ended his career at the company entirely, a quiet consequence for a man who had spent years believing flattery toward the powerful mattered more than basic decency toward everyone else. Sterling Hawthorne found himself facing civil litigation and permanent removal from every position he had once held within Blackwell Arrow, his name quietly erased from the very company he had once tried to reshape in his own image. At the boarding gate, Vivian approached Callum one final time and asked, almost gently, whether he wanted seat 1A on this particular flight. Callum looked down at the boarding pass in his hand, then walked over and offered it instead to a young engineer flying in first class for the very first time in her career. He told her quietly that seat 1A only carries meaning when the person sitting in it remembers they are no higher than anyone else around them. Vivian watched him walk away toward the terminal exit, no entourage, no fanfare, the same worn case swinging gently at his side that had carried the weight of an entire company's reckoning weeks earlier. She thought about calling after him, about saying something more, but decided the moment did not need another word from her. Some lessons settle best in silence, and this was one of them. She turned back toward her own gate, straightened her coat, and walked forward carrying a version of confidence that finally had less to do with appearances and more to do with the harder, quieter work of earning it. The aircraft lifted into the sky without announcements or spectacle, without laughter aimed at anyone, without a single voice raised in contempt. Inside the cabin, the young engineer who now sat in seat 1A pressed her palm flat against the armrest, half expecting someone to tell her a mistake had been made, but no one did. She simply watched the clouds pass beneath the window and allowed herself, for the length of one flight, to believe she belonged exactly where she was sitting. What remained behind on the ground was a company that had finally learned, at great cost, that true power never lives inside a chair. It lives inside the person who can rise from that chair and still command the respect of everyone watching. And it lives, just as surely, in the quiet decision to hand that chair to someone else the moment it no longer needs proving. Somewhere over the clouds that afternoon, a company once defined by appearances continued flying forward, carrying inside it the slow, hard-won beginning of something closer to fairness.